Cecilia Green, herself then a newly minted PhD in sociology, asked me, where is this global Africa that Masri talks about? I've been completely taken in by the novel thought of Africa being global, just as whiteness is boundless, even as I had some initial unease about the grandiloquence of the expression. At least it's a compact two-word notion, rolling off the tongue a little more easily than other formulations. I had no answer for Cecilia Green, so I had to go back to the drawing board. Thus chastened, I went back, rewatched, and studied Masri's Global Africa episode. Not only that, the entire series. I concluded that Professor Masri was signaling, without explicitly articulating it, the death of what I call classical Pan-Africanism. The 5 congresses plus the All-Africa Congress. Classical Pan-Africanism has ended not only because the conclaves following the All-Africa Congress were by comparison quite anemic events. Classical Pan-Africanism has ended because it has achieved its historic mission: African independence and the passage of civil rights legislation in the 1960s. But I categorically disagree with Masri's agenda. One of the things that Masri does is in the debate over reparations. He says we should take it easy on the Middle East. We should address the biggest challenge first. That is what is owed to Africa and Africans by the West. Slavery in the Arab world, Masri argued, was, or is it still, multicultural. The rich in the Middle East, no matter how they look, no matter their phenotype, Ali Masri argues, enslaved whoever they fancied. So there are black Arabs who own white slaves, and there are white Arabs who own black slaves. So it's an equal opportunity kind of thing. So it's not exactly like the terrible experience of slavery in the West. What is most important is that historically, it was both the indigenous Arab and African slave systems that provided the fertile soil in which the seeds of the Atlantic trade germinated in the first place. It is true that the debate about reparations in one form or another needs to concentrate on the really big fish in the West, those whose ill-gotten wealth from the traffic in African souls form the integral part of the basis of the industrialization of a West that still continues to exploit the rest of us. And doesn't it make moral and ethical sense for charity to begin at home, that in the quest for reparations, doesn't it make sense to start by addressing why Africans, well, again, I'm also falling into the trap. Very often it's stated very generally that Africans enslaved other Africans, and that's a bad thing. Of course, white people also enslaved other white people. The English moved into all the things that we have experienced here in Africa and the rest of the world, as far as the English were concerned, that started in Ireland. All the terms, the terrible terms by which Africans were called, were and continue to be called, were first applied by the English to the Irish. So let's have some perspective on this. But let's not say that African slavery was a lot more humane, so that's okay. It's not. Because if the Enlightenment teaches us anything for which you should be grateful, is that no human being, no matter what the color of his skin, deserves to be enslaved. That is where we start from. So we start from critiquing historical slavery on the African continent, and mind you, some of those forms of slavery are still here today. You go to Paris, you go into those neighborhoods that African immigrants live. There are still master-slave relations even outside of the continent, in those hostels in Paris. There are some of those African immigrants in France who have to turn in their paycheck to somebody in that same hostel who they consider their master. So why don't we deal with that? And when we finish with that, why don't we deal with slavery in the Middle East? It is true that the debate about reparations in one form or another needs to concentrate on the really big fish in the West, whose ill-gotten wealth from the traffic in human souls formed an integral part of the industrialization of the West that is still continues to exploit the rest of us. And doesn't it make moral and ethical sense for charity to begin at home in Africa, in deepening the effect of Matthew Kereku's apology to African Americans? Now, I need to explain this. Not long ago, Henry Louis Gates published an essay, I think in the New York Times, in which he argued that when we talk about reparations, we should also talk about what Africans should pay, because they were also equally involved. Wouldn't it be? So that is a question that has to be addressed. Slavery, historical and contemporary, on the African continent, and not only that, the continuing enslavement of Africans who are being shipped out every day today to the Middle East. As a journalist, I've had occasion to interview some Africans who escaped from bondage in the 1990s in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Bahrain and Oman. And with a global Africa. So if classical Pan-Africanism is dead because its historical leaders have achieved what they wanted for themselves, that of running neo-colonies on the continent, and that of moving from the neighborhoods into the suburbs, what then is the agenda for global Africa? Mazrui's very useful arithmetic sum is nonetheless unidirectional. He says Africa plus the diaspora of the Middle Passage plus the diaspora of colonialism. Real life really doesn't work like that. It's not a simple sum. It's a complicated sum. What about the increasing current traffic in the opposite direction? There are African Americans who are taking early retirement, taking the money, and building homes in Ghana. And I just learned recently something that broke my heart, that in Ghana there are now questions being raised. Oh, there are too many African Americans. They are going to take the country over. And I say, oh my God. same old argument that we hear here, that immigrants are taking over our jobs. It's happening in my home country. I would have thought not long ago there was a constitutional amendment which authorizes any African American, any black person from the diaspora to attain Ghanaian citizenship. That is being reviewed. To get Ghanaian citizenship now, as an African American, you have to prove that you can speak an African language. I said, what bollocks?